Hi, this is Larry Wallington, your instructor for this class. And you know what? This is great because this is you guys are one of the first classes with the new curriculum. And because of that, I want to do this short video of instruction on operating systems because I was going through the curriculum. I started didn't get too deep in operating systems, so I just wanted to cover a couple of things that the instruction didn't really go over very well. When we talk about operating systems, I think most of us are probably familiar with the desktop operating systems. If you depend on what type of computer you may have yourself, you may have a Windows machine. You could be running Windows 7, Windows 8, or if you got a newer machine, you're probably running Windows 10. And some folks like myself, I'm a Mac user. I could say so. You got the Mac operating system, and there's another operating system that's very popular. It's Linux, and some of you guys are probably familiar with Linux. And I will probably tell you this: that if you're not um, obviously familiar with it, I guarantee you that you probably use it every day and you don't even realize it. With things like cell phones, with your microwave oven, the audio system in your car if you have a newer car. Most of those are running on a Linux operating system. And when I look at these three operating systems, Windows, Mac, Linux, there's always a discussion, well, what's best, a Windows, a Mac, or what? Well, it really comes down to personal preference because there's advantages and disadvantages to both. One of the advantages of Windows is, like I say, it's very, it's common, it's easy to use, it runs on a lot of platforms, there's a lot of software that's compatible with it. Some of the disadvantages is actually some of the same things that are the advantages. Is because of the effort to make it very compatible with a lot of different hardware platforms. It uses things like registries and INI files to do a lot of those conversions. So sometimes it becomes kind of complicated because there's a lot of things going on in the background, and it isn't always 100% compatible with every piece of hardware that it runs on. The thing with the Macintosh, like I say, the Macintosh operating system is more tightly coupled with the hardware. So it makes some of the operations much smoother. And there's some things internally with Mac operating systems because it is a Unix variant. If you look at the Mac operating system, it was built off of Unix. But some of the disadvantages, it's not as compatible with everything else. Kind of the Mac family runs within itself. We look at Linux. Linux is an operating system. The good thing about Linux, it's free. It's what we call open source. Open source means that the code is free. You can download different types and different flavors of what they call distributions of Linux operating systems, and it's great. If you love playing around with that, I recommend go out onto one of the Linux websites like Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a very popular Linux uh, very user-friendly Linux operating system. I use it quite a bit for different things that I do. And like I say, if you got an old laptop around the house or an old desktop and you don't want to upgrade it with Windows or whatever, load Linux on it. It'll run great. Linux runs on about any platform. It's very lightweight, doesn't use a lot of memory and a lot of resources. Some of the disadvantages that people don't like about Linux is because of the fact that it is open source. Well, you don't have the 1-800 hotline, the Windows service or the Mac service that you may get. To me, that's an advantage. Why? Because Linux operates within a community, meaning that you've got programmers from all over the world who comes in and help build the different Linux distributions. So now you've got a lot of people working on a problem. So updates to Linux happens pretty quickly. Great thing about Linux is actually it runs a lot of your servers and a lot of your computers across the globe is running on Linux platforms. So when we think about those are the big three. Now, are there other operating systems out there? You bet. There's many different types of operating systems, but those are kind of the big three that we talk about when we think about desktop operating systems. Now, mobile operating systems. Yeah. So let's say you have a cell phone. Guess what? You have an operating system inside of that cell phone. Actually, you probably have two operating systems. Most of your cell phones, the way they operate, you have one operating system that controls the radio, the RF side of your phone, and you have another operating system that controls the interface, the user interface piece of your phone. But like I say, looking across the expanse, like, there's lots of mobile operating systems out there. Some of the older ones, Sabian, like I say, those are some of your earlier operating systems that ran on your Nokia. If you had, your flip phone, you remember those old flip phones? So I know some student out there, one of you guys probably still have a flip phone. I don't know which one, but if you do, it's probably running some type of Sabian. If you've got an iPhone, it's running iOS, which is the Mac operating system. A very good operating system that isn't used a lot now, but it was RIM, BlackBerry. They ran on RIM. Windows came up with their own mobile operating system. Didn't catch a lot of traction. One, because they made it very complicated. They tried to replicate their desktop, and it was just too much to try to put into a small box. Again, Linux. A lot of your phones have a Linux core. If you have an Android, if a type phone, yep, that's a Linux core or or kernel that's running in that phone. Palm. If you don't know many of you guys remember Palm, yeah, Palm was an operating system that was awesome, very tightly coupled to the device, ran good, didn't crash a lot, and like I say, then you got the Android, the family of phones. That many of the makers have out there. So like I say, you got mobile desktop operating systems, you got mobile operating systems. There's also, and I'm going to talk about here, but embedded operating system. That's an operating system that's embedded inside of something, like your microwave oven. Yes, there is an operating system inside of that, or your Roku device, or your DVD players, all that stuff you got in your house. There's an operating system inside of there that's kind of the brains that's making this thing work. Okay, speaking of brain, let's talk about what an operating system actually does. It's pretty simple. The operating system is the interface between your user and your computer hardware. So if we start at the bottom of this stack down here, you see that, let me turn my laser pointer here. There we go. If you look at a computer, let's just talk about your desktop or maybe your laptop. This layer here is what we call the hardware. That's your CPU, your hard drive, all those things, your power supply, memory, storage, all of those things that make up your computer. Now, what sits right on top of that is your operating system. So when you install, like I said, we install Windows 10, or we install, Linux, Ubuntu, we're installing that on the operating system. And then our applications, such as Microsoft Office or Adobe or PowerPoint or any of those applications are installed on the operating system. And us, the user, we interface with the application interface with the operating system, and the operating system interface with the hardware. And this is built by design this way, really from a security perspective, because applications or a user or an application typically do not talk directly to hardware. Actually, so it has to go through the operating system that talks to the hardware or talks to the hard drive. The operating system really tells is a file structure that tells your operating system, that tells your hard drive how to save files and how to retrieve files. For the more seasoned individuals in our class, we won't call you old, we just say you're more seasoned, more mature. You probably remember back in the day when we used to have something called DOS, which was DOS, Disk Operating System. And that really what Microsoft came with, and that was what would manage the hardware, or the CPU and the hard drive. It was the file system. It managed the file structure on your hard drive. So yeah, and DOS actually ran for quite a few years underneath your Windows operating systems. So when you think about operating system, like I said, just remember it's the interface between the user and your computer hardware. So now let's talk about the operating system structure. At the very heart of every operating system is something we call a kernel, like a kernel of corn. Yeah, kernel. So that is a set of instructions. It's really just code. It's a compiled code that controls how your hardware, like we talked about in the previous slide, it talks to your hard drive. As a matter of fact, when you first turn on your computer, after it goes through the boot process and the boot up, that's what it does. Then it goes out and looks for that kernel. So the hard drive is sending commands to the kernel, and then the kernel is what starts the rest of the operating system to turn on. So like I say, if you look at your computer when you first power it up, it doesn't say Microsoft, does it? No, you see something called BIOS, and the BIOS turns on, and then whatever brand of computer it has, usually that logo comes up. Well, that's the boot process, because at that point, it doesn't even know where an operating system is. It has to go out and look for one. And typically, by default, it will go look at the hard drive, and it's looking for the bootloader that's in the kernel, and that is what starts the whole process. And then you see the Windows logo come up, and it goes from there. So that's the kernel that does that. So like I say, so the kernel, like I say, it connects your applications and software to the hardware of the computer. And actually, the kernel is a computer program that manages your inputs and your output requests from your software. It does all the translation of your data processing instructions. And it talks to the CPU, your central processing unit, and all the electronic components in your computer, such as your USB bus and all those things. So actually, so really that kernel is the fundamental part of your computer. It does. It talks to your CPU. It also allocates memory as well as talk to all your different devices. And then it is that layer between the applications and those hardware components. So now we got the kernel. What's come next? Well, the next layer on top of the kernel is what we call APIs, or application programming interfaces, or they're kind of like drivers. Like I say, if you remember, the kernel had to have a way of talking to the other layers above it. And we use this layer called application programming interfaces as a standard way for programmers to be able to write code to talk to the next layer above it. And what is that layer? These are your operating systems applications. So as you say, what's an operating system application? I'm glad you asked that question, because I'm going to tell you what a operating system application is. Operating systems applications, not to be confused with user applications, they're the ones that come with your operating system. Let's take Windows, for instance. When you load up Windows 10, before you put Office on there, there are certain applications like your control panel, like your file explorer, your print manager, accessories, all of those. See, those are applications that are part of your operating system. Yeah, they come with the operating system when you load it up. Like saying, we don't want to confuse those with your user applications up here, like Microsoft Office or Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Adobe. Those are user applications, and they are not a part of your operating system. I just put these up here for illustration. But when we think about an operating system, these are the components that make up your operating system: the kernel, the APIs, and the API is that like a driver, is that interface that talks to your operating system applications. So yeah, so when you think, and I know normally we don't think of those things as applications, but they are. Control panel, like say if you go into Windows Explorer, that is actually an application. That's a piece of software that was code that was written to operate with Windows. Got it? Excellent. Good deal. Now, what does an operating system actually do? That's a good question, and I'm glad whoever asked that question too. Okay, so when we think about at the core, that kernel, what it's controlling, and I usually like to break it down to these 5 core functions. It does a lot more, but this is I'm trying to keep this at kind of the 101, the basic level of what the functions of an operating system. Like I say, it's the programs used to manage and control, first of all, your files. That's really probably 90, I won't say 90, but a large percentage of what this operating system does, the kernel. It controls the file structure. If you've heard of things like FAT, F-A-T, file allocation table, FAT32, FAT16, that is how your operating system formats your hard drive so it knows where to write information and data on that hard drive. So and there's different file systems out there. EFI, there's multiple file system, NFS, network file system, UEFI. I mean, there's a ton of those. We won't get into those, but basically, just think of those as a format. It's the format so that the hard drive knows how to communicate with the operating system, with the kernel of the operating system. So that is a big part of what that does. Now, it also manages your CPU, your central processing unit. And your central processing unit, as you probably already know, that is the brains. That is the brains of the operation. We call it the brains, but really it's a pretty dumb thing. It's a big adding machine because all it really does is add binary numbers, ones and zeros. We call them that. But yeah, that is what actually does your arithmetic, your arithmetic functions, and actually where your code that comes from your hard drive. If you want to load up an application, your operating system brings that code into memory and then into your CPU. Now we talk about memory. Yeah, your operating system also it allocates, and it's what takes information back and forth. Like for instance, from your hard drive to your memory. When we talk memory, we're talking RAM. Like what we call volatile memory, RAM. You got your computer, you say, well, how much RAM I got? I got 32 gig of RAM. Not to be confused with storage. Storage is your hard drive. Now, a hard drive, you may have, a 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte hard drive. And so there's a difference between memory and storage. When we're talking memory, we're talking like say RAM. Storage, we're talking about your files, your hard drive, and how files are stored there. Now, your operating system also controls I/O. What is the I/O? Input-output devices. So what is an input-output device? Well, I've got one in my hand right now. It's called a mouse. That mouse is an input device, or your keyboard input device. Output devices are things like your monitor, printers, as well as USB ports or Thunderbolt, whatever type of ports you have on your computers. Those are part of what we call I/O, or input-output devices. And your operating system controls how information is channeled back and forth between your input-output devices and through via memory, and how your CPU manipulates that information. So if you hit a key on your keyboard, that has to be translated into something that your CPU understands, and your operating system helps do that translation and puts it into a thing called registers, and it processes it. And the operating system also controls your networking. So for instance, if you have a network interface card, if you're going to set up a wireless connection with your computer, your operating system controls those. So when we look around, like I say, I just kind of break these up into 5 general areas. It controls your central processing unit, your memory, your file structure on your hard drive, input-output devices like USBs and keyboards, mice, all those types of things, and your networking. So you see, your operating system does quite a few functions. All right, so there we go. I've given you a quick overview of operating systems and operating systems functions. We've talked about the different types of desktop operating systems as well as mobile operating systems, and briefly covered some of the advantages and disadvantages. I hope you enjoyed this. I will post this video as well as the PowerPoint slide onto our learning management system, so you can have access to it. This is just a freebie here. Like I said, there's no tests or anything on this, but I just wanted to kind of open up the aperture a little bit wider on operating systems. Thanks, and God bless you. And you may see another video somewhere in the future. Hope so. I'm out.